Forget everything you were taught in school about the backward Middle Ages and the dark centuries. What I'm about to show you turns the usual picture of the world upside down, and official science would much rather you never heard about it. In a remote Indian province, next to a tiny village lost among jungles and rice fields, stands a stone structure. At first glance, an ordinary ancient temple. There are thousands like it in India, but once you step closer, a chill runs down your spine. This temple sings. Yes, you heard that correctly. Its stone columns ring like bronze bells. Its 5-ton statues are polished to a mirror shine, and your own face reflects back at you through 8 centuries. Its bricks refuse to sink in water. Its foundation is built using a technology which Japanese and American engineers will only invent in the 20th century. And inside its stone run curving channels so narrow that even a thin needle cannot pass through them. Only a flexible wire, millimeter by millimeter, following their mysterious bends. How is any of this possible? Where did a medieval master in a remote Indian village get technology which the modern world has only just caught up with today? Who really built this temple? And why can the best engineers of the 21st century, with all their computers, lasers and diamond machines, not reproduce a single one of its secrets? In this investigation, we will break it all down, piece by piece. Every mystery, every fact, every number. You will find out why this building survived an earthquake that flattened everything around it. You will hear the name of the general who commissioned its construction. You will understand what impossible industry must have stood behind its rise, and why not a trace of that industry remains. And most importantly, at the very end of this video, I will name the one hypothesis which makes academics deeply uncomfortable. The hypothesis that explains everything, and which people are still afraid to say out loud. Stay with me all the way to the end. That is where you will find what this whole video was really worth making for. Let's go. In the heart of the Indian state of Telangana, well off the tourist trails, next to a tiny village called Palampet, stands a stone time bomb aimed straight at mainstream academic science. The Ramappa Temple. Over 800 years old, and not a single crack, not a single collapse, not a single convincing explanation. Local villagers walk past it every single day, the way you and I walk past the grocery store on the corner. And yet, standing right there in front of them is an object that makes certified architects all over the world blush. Because nobody today can reproduce what was built here in the 13th century. Not European engineers with their computer simulations, not the Japanese with their precision machining, not the Americans with their laser-cutting technologies. Nobody. This belongs to that rare category of monuments which, by their very existence, put modern civilization in an uncomfortable position. We pride ourselves on skyscrapers and Mars rovers, and yet a simple Indian temple with no electricity, no motors, not a single nail in the familiar sense, stands exactly as it has always stood, and quietly mocks our arrogance. Stop and think about it for a second. 800 years. That is longer than the entire history of the United States, taken more than 3 times in a row. During that span, whole empires have risen and fallen, religions have come and gone, libraries have burned, capitals have been reduced to rubble. And yet Ramappa stands straight, stands proud, and stays silent. Silent but not entirely, because anyone who walks up to its columns and taps them lightly with a finger hears a clean, ringing tone in response, as if a bell were hidden deep inside the stone. Anyone who looks closely at its walls notices carvings so fine that no modern machine can repeat them. And anyone bold enough to pick up one of the bricks from its tower nearly drops it in astonishment, because that brick does not sink in water. And this is exactly where things get uncomfortable, because not a single professor, not a single engineer, not a single material scientist can give a proper answer to the simplest question of all. How was this done? Not by whom, not why, not when. We still have some kind of answer for those. But how exactly? From what blueprints? On what equipment? With the help of what knowledge that, according to our own textbooks, should not and could not have existed among people of that era? This is where the real story begins. A story that official science prefers to brush aside, and a story it is high time we told honestly, with no cuts and no deference to authority. Now let us get to the hard facts that even the most skeptical critics cannot wave away. On one of the temple walls, carved into a polished basalt pillar, roughly the height of a grown man, there is an inscription. 204 tightly packed lines of medieval text. This is not a legend passed down by word of mouth, not a guess made by archaeologists, not a loose interpretation offered by some local guide. This is an official document from the 13th century, cut into stone by the builders themselves. The inscription states it plainly. The temple was founded in the year 1213 of the Common Era. The patron of the works was Recherla Rudra, a general, a military commander, the right hand of King Ganapati Deva of the Kakatiya dynasty. That very dynasty which ruled the eastern Deccan from the 12th to the 14th century and left behind a scattering of stone masterpieces all across southern India. This belongs to those extremely rare cases in world architecture where we know almost everything about a building. The exact year it was started, the name of the patron, the name of the master craftsman, Ramappa, the sculptor himself, whose name the local people later transferred onto the temple. An astonishing case. Across the entire Indian subcontinent, this is essentially the only major temple named not after a god and not after a king, but after a simple stonemason. The voice of the common people turned out to be louder than any royal decree. The work was done carefully, without haste. 40 years for a single temple. For comparison, the entire Moscow armory chamber inside the Kremlin took 2 years to build. Notre Dame in Paris took 85, but that was a cathedral meant to serve half a city. Here, though, we are talking about a stand-alone temple in a provincial district to which the builders devoted almost half a century. What does that tell you? Only one thing, that the work was not handled by day laborers, but by the finest masters of their time, and every single detail was polished to perfection. Recherla Rudra, after whom the temple received its second name, Rudreshwara, meaning the temple of Lord Rudra, is a figure worth a separate story. The man who saved the Kakatiya kingdom from falling apart. A military commander who crushed rebellions of vassals, repelled invasions by neighbors, and restored his monarch to the throne. Epigraphic evidence has preserved his own words, carved into stone. He boasts openly of cutting off the head of one particularly troublesome feudal lord and displaying it on a tall pole as a warning to every other enemy of the crown. This is not some abstract mythical figure. This is a living, hard-handed, authoritative man of flesh and blood, with an army at his back and real political power in his hands. It was exactly this kind of man who commissioned the Ramappa Temple. Not some reclusive monk, not some dreamy mystic, but a pragmatic general who knew full well that he was taking on a project the like of which his kingdom had never seen before. And now, the most important point of all. In the year 2021, UNESCO officially inscribed the Ramappa Temple on the list of World Heritage Sites. The 39th site from India. The only Indian nomination that year, and it passed on the first round with no disputes and no delays. In other words, we are not dealing with some questionable village curiosity here. We are dealing with a monument whose authenticity and uniqueness have been confirmed at the very highest international level by the global expert community. And long before UNESCO, back in the late 13th century, the famous Venetian traveller Marco Polo passed through these lands. When he saw the temple, he is said to have called it the brightest star in the galaxy of temples. A beautiful phrase, yet an accurate one, because Indian architecture really does have plenty of stars scattered across its sky, and Ramappa shines brighter than all of them. And this is precisely why any conversation about this building cannot be brushed aside with a casual, nice architecture, that is all. Behind that nice architecture stands a document cut in stone, 40 years of labor, the name of a general, the name of a master craftsman, the seal of UNESCO, and the admiration of Marco Polo himself. A foundation of facts on which everything else in this story stands. Now take a close look at the base of this temple and brace yourself for the first serious blow to common sense. Ramappa does not sit on an ordinary slab, nor on the plain square plinth most temples of the same era used. It rises up from a platform shaped like a star, a proper geometrically precise star, roughly 1 meter and 80 centimeters high. Let that detail sink in. 13th century, no laser levels, no theodolites, no modern structural software. And yet the rays of the star spread out from the central point with such accuracy that when modern instruments are laid over its blueprint, they find no deviations. Every angle holds, every symmetry is respected. Every edge meets exactly where it was meant to meet. By today's standards, this is the level of work expected from a trained civil engineer with a university degree. This belongs to that architectural tradition of the Kakatiya dynasty, which specialists have long grown tired of praising for the perfection of its lines. Yet in the case of Ramappa, the matter is far more serious. Nobody within 1,000 kilometers, neither before nor after the 13th century, ever repeated this solution on such a scale. Star-shaped foundations do appear in Indian tradition, but always under small shrines. Here, though, the star carries the full weight of an entire temple complex. That kind of load distribution problem is no longer craftsmanship, it is engineering science. The main body of the temple is laid in a reddish sandstone of warm tone. Under the Indian daytime sun, it seems to glow from within. And in the evening, when the sun slides toward the horizon, the walls fill with a deep copper color and the stone looks almost molten. Above this sandstone, along the perimeter of the building, stand columns made of a completely different material. Polished black basalt, rich in iron, magnesium and silicon. 2 colors, 2 temperaments, 2 entirely different stones, joined within a single structure with mathematical precision. This combination was not chosen purely for beauty, or rather, not only for beauty. Red sandstone is relatively soft, which makes it easy to cut with fine carving work. Black basalt is one of the hardest and densest stones found in nature. It was used wherever strength and load-bearing capacity mattered most. In other words, the builders understood materials science. They knew which stone was suited to which task. They knew that building the whole temple out of a single material would ruin either the carving or the structure. Today, this is taught in specialized universities in advanced courses. Back then, it was already known and applied in a provincial Indian principality 800 years ago. Now to the dimensions. The platform itself stands roughly 1 meter 80 centimeters tall. This is not an architect's whim. This is protection against monsoon flooding, against rising groundwater, against the moisture that destroys any stone building on a lowland plain. The radiating shape of the star distributes the weight of the temple across a larger number of support points and dampens seismic shocks, something we will come back to separately when the conversation turns to the earthquake of 1843. In other words, this stone star beneath the building is not decoration. It is an engineering solution ahead of its time by at least 5 or 6 centuries. And right next to the temple lies a lake, man-made as well, also built in the 13th century, also constructed by the men of Recherla Rudra. The surface of the water reflects the red sandstone and the black basalt. All around stretch forests, foothills, not a single tall building for dozens of kilometers in any direction. The landscape is almost untouched. And right in the middle of it sits this star-shaped arc, as if it had landed here according to a blueprint nobody in that era could possibly have possessed. Now lift your gaze a little higher, past the platform, up to where the basalt columns meet the roofline. And here begins the part for which Ramappa is visited not so much by casual tourists as by serious engineers, sculptors and art historians from all over the world. On the upper brackets, at the points where the columns join the ceiling beams, sit enormous stone figures, dancing women, mythical beasts, warriors, celestial spirits. They seem frozen mid-movement, caught in half a step, in the middle of a gesture, looking down at anyone who dares walk in beneath them. The first thing that hits the eye is the shine. Not the matte surface typical of most medieval carvings, not the rough texture of untreated stone, but a pure mirror-like gloss, as if these statues had been cast out of polished steel and coated with lacquer. In bright light, your own face reflects back at you from their surfaces. 8 centuries later, through monsoon rains, through dust, heat, and that very earthquake of 1843, not a single scratch, not a single scuff, not a single chip in places where there should not be one. This belongs to the very peak of the Kakatiya sculptural school, which specialists compare only with classical Greek sculpture. The curves of the bodies, the proportions of the faces, the finest folds of the clothing, everything is cut with a precision no medieval European master could dream of. And now, the main point. Each one of these figures is carved from a single solid piece of black basalt, not glued together, not assembled from smaller blocks, not reinforced with any metal rods. One stone, one sculpture. And now about the weight. Each figure weighs in at roughly 5 tons. 5 tons is the weight of an average African elephant, or if you prefer, 2 off-road vehicles stacked one on top of the other. And this massive object was not only cut from stone with jeweler's precision by medieval Indian builders, they also lifted it to the height of a modern 2nd or 3rd floor and placed it on top of a column with such accuracy that the center of gravity rests exactly on the supporting point, so the sculpture does not tilt by so much as a millimeter. And this is where the uncomfortable questions begin. What machines were used for this? Where is the 13th century crane capable of lifting 5 tons to a height of 6 or 7 meters? Where is the scaffolding that could hold such a load? Where is the counterweight system? Where, finally, are the traces of any construction equipment at all suited to a job of this caliber? Archaeologists have been digging the grounds around the temple for over 100 years. Nothing has been found. No blocks, no rollers, no tracks, no remains of wooden platforms. Nothing at all that could explain how. The official version boils down to a standard formula. Supposedly, earthen ramps were piled up, the monoliths were dragged up the gentle slope on wooden rollers, and afterwards the earth was cleared away. A neat formula, but for a 5-ton sculpture with a mirror polish, it simply does not work. Because any contact with soil, with rollers, with ropes, with anything at all, inevitably leaves marks on a surface polished to that kind of shine. Scuffs, micro scratches, chips on the edges. On the figures of Ramappa, no such marks exist, not one. On top of that, every statue is mounted on its bracket at a complex angle with a slight forward tilt, so the viewer standing below sees the face correctly without perspective distortion. In other words, the work was not put it up and forget it. It was calculated for the optics of human perception. This is no longer simple assembly. This is a carefully planned artistic installation in which every centimeter is the result of precise calculation. For comparison, take a look at Warangal Fort, the capital of the same Kakatiya state, a little over 60 kilometers away. The sculptures there come from the same school, the same era, the same level of craftsmanship. But in what condition? In fragments. Broken heads, torn-off arms, shattered torsos, scattered across piles of rubble. In Ramappa, everything stands as it was placed, standing straight, standing whole. Standing as if the craftsman had only just finished work and stepped out for lunch. The same style, the same stone, the same century, the same masters in theory. The results? Incomparable. Which means that during the building of Ramappa, something was used that was not used in other temples of the same period. Some additional technology, some special knowledge, some approach of which neither records, nor tools, nor disciples have survived. And this is only the first in a whole chain of mysteries this temple still has in store for us. Now is the right moment to step away from Ramappa for a second and look around. How are its stone contemporaries in the neighborhood doing? Because as long as we kept talking about a single temple, it could still feel like, well, an exception, a unique case. These things happen. But once you take a wider view, the picture changes completely. And it becomes very uncomfortable for the official version of history. The Kakatiya dynasty ruled these lands for more than 200 years, and during that time, they built dozens of major temple complexes, stone sanctuaries, fortresses, pillared halls, water reservoirs, palaces, all from the same red sandstone and the same black basalt. The same guilds were at work, trained by the same masters, using, as our textbooks assure us, the same methods. Logic suggests that if the construction technology was the same, then the condition of the monuments after 8 centuries should be more or less comparable. This belongs to a basic principle of archaeology. Monuments from the same period, the same region, and the same school age in similar ways. If the stone has cracked somewhere, it ought to crack in the next temple too. If the sculptures have shattered at one site, they should be in a similar state at the neighboring one. That is how time works. That is how nature works. That is how materials physics works. Arguing with this is pointless. And now to the facts. 66 kilometers from Ramappa stands Warangal Fort, the former capital of the Kakatiya state, the heart of the realm, the jewel of the empire. In scale, incomparably larger than Ramappa. In richness of decoration, even more opulent. In political significance for the era, on a completely different level. You would think Warangal, of all places, should have survived the best, because behind it stood the full power of the state, the finest masters and the finest materials. What do we see at Warangal today? Piles of rubble, fragments of columns scattered across the grounds, broken-off heads, crumbled torsos, crushed arches. The famous Kirti Torana gates, 4 magnificent stone portals, now stand alone in the middle of an empty field because almost nothing of the temple around them has survived. Sculptural brackets, similar to the ones decorating Ramappa, appear at Warangal only as isolated fragments, not a single intact figure, not a single untouched composition, only pieces that archaeologists painstakingly collect from the fields, like parts of a giant jigsaw. The same picture emerges a little further out. The 1,000-pillar temple in Hanamkonda, another masterpiece of the Kakatiya style, another name on any list of classical Indian architecture. Condition: seriously damaged, in constant need of restoration. Part of the pillared hall in the 20th century had to be essentially dismantled and reassembled because the structure was shifting. The temples of Ganpur, same period, same school. Today they are effectively ruins. Walls crumbled, roofs collapsed, carvings ground into dust. The list goes on. Kotagulu, Nagulapadu, Kotagiri, dozens of names, each of which was once a flourishing religious center. Today they appear mostly in academic articles with words like ruined, partly preserved, decorative elements lost. And in the middle of all this stone erosion, in the middle of this wave of destruction that swept across an entire region for 8 centuries, stands Ramappa, alone and unmoved, without cracks, without collapses, without losses. With the same mirror-polished statues on its columns, the same carvings on its walls, the same 40 meters of perfectly laid stonework as in the 13th century. The same era, the same stone, the same dynasty, the same masters, and the result, strikingly different. This is no longer coincidence, this is a pattern. This is a sign that during the building of Ramappa, something fundamentally different was applied. Some knowledge, some technique, some technological ingredient which the neighboring construction sites simply did not have access to. What exactly, no one can say. But closing one's eyes to this contrast is no longer possible. And here is one more point that people tend not to say out loud. Many Kakatiya temples were destroyed not by time, but by human hands. The armies of the Delhi Sultanate, which came to these lands in the early 14th century, systematically dismantled Hindu sanctuaries, leveled them to the ground, smashed their sculptures, carted off their stone for their own construction projects. And right in the middle of that slaughter, Ramappa survived. Why? There are many versions. Some say it was lucky, tucked away from the main roads. Others claim the invaders were unsettled by something in that place they did not understand. Still others suggest that the temple itself possesses properties we today would call inexplicable. No documents remain to settle the question once and for all. All that remains are the fragments of neighboring temples and whole, glowing, stone-singing Ramappa. Now we move on to a detail that leaves modern mechanical engineers literally throwing up their hands. Because what we are about to describe is, from the standpoint of today's technology, either impossible or requires equipment worth millions of dollars. We are talking about the decorative channels inside the basalt of the Ramappa Temple. Walk up to any of the carved details on the columns or the walls. Look carefully, and you will see there are through-going channels inside the stone. Tiny ones, only a few millimeters in diameter, so narrow that even a pencil lead barely fits through. At first glance, well, a hole is a hole. Plenty of holes have been drilled around the world over 8 centuries. But then comes the part that simply will not fit inside the head. These channels are not straight. They curve. They run inside a single piece of basalt along a complex, winding path. They turn at angles. They change direction. They weave around internal elements of the carving. Sometimes they enter the stone on one side, make an S-shaped bend, and exit on the other, at a spot that an ordinary tool simply cannot reach. Not from outside, not from inside. Physically impossible. This belongs to that very class of technical problems that gives modern stoneworking specialists a nervous twitch. Try producing this in a laboratory in the 21st century. Basalt is one of the hardest stones on the planet. On the Mohs scale, it rates 6 to 7. The closest everyday comparison in terms of hardness is tempered steel. So drilling even a straight hole a few millimeters wide into basalt today is possible only with a diamond bit under water cooling. Otherwise, the tool overheats and seizes up within a minute. Straight, exactly straight, because any drill lowered into stone follows strictly along its own axis. It does not know how to turn. Physics does not allow it. To bend a channel inside a monolith, you need either a flexible drill with a real-time control mechanism. Such tools appeared in medicine and in the nuclear industry in the late 20th century and cost as much as a decent apartment. Or chemical treatment along a pre-laid channel, or a technology that humanity simply does not yet possess. Now for the million-dollar question. In the 13th century, in an Indian province, with no electricity, no diamond cutters, no laboratory machines, how? What tool did the stonemason of Ramappa used to drill a winding passage through the hardest basalt. And not just one. There are dozens of such channels on the temple, perhaps hundreds. Nobody has ever finished counting them. Researchers back in the 20th century performed a simple experiment. They took a thin needle and tried to push it through one of these channels. The needle would not pass. It jammed at the very first bend, which means the trajectory is so complex that a straight object physically cannot enter it. Then they took a flexible copper wire, thin, soft, obedient. The wire went through, slowly with effort, following every curve of the channel, but it went through, which means the channel really is through going. It does not dead end inside the stone. It runs from one point on the outside surface to another. Now try to explain that. Take any modern stoneworking master, show him the photographs, tell him it is the 13th century and the builders had nothing but iron chisels, copper punches, and handheld abrasive tools. Then ask for an answer. Most masters simply shrug. A minority say, "This cannot be. There must be some kind of error. Let me look for myself." They look. They stay silent, and their silence is very telling. There is a theory that these channels were formed while the stone was still soft. That is, before the basalt finally hardened into the monolithic mass we see today. Some organic core, a wax cord or a plant fiber strand, for example, was laid along the planned lines, the stone set around it, and then the core was burned or etched out. A nice theory. There is only one problem. For this to work, basalt would have to be in a plastic, workable state at some point. And basalt, as geology tells us, never is. It is either molten at 1500 degrees or solid rock. There are no intermediate phases, which means either the ancient Indian masters mastered the art of stone casting at a level we cannot even dream of today. We will return to this separately. Or they used some method of pinpoint high temperature or chemical treatment whose traces we simply cannot recognize. Or, and this is the version that sits most uncomfortably with science, they used a tool whose operating principle is still unknown to us. And notice, these curved channels serve no structural function. They are pure decorative perfection. The master wanted the carving to be backlit. He wanted the light to play inside its patterns. He wanted air to pass through the stone and the breath of the wind to reach the interior. He could easily have done without these passages. The temple would stand exactly the same. But he made them because he could, because he knew how, because he possessed the knowledge. And we today, with all our industrial diamond machines, with computer-controlled software, with laser cutting and plasma treatment, cannot replicate it. On this one single point, a 13th century stonemason stepped ahead of us by at least a whole generation of technologies. This is no longer an exaggeration. This is a dry statement of fact. But even this is far from everything. Because the next riddle of Ramappa does not work on the eye or on the intellect. It strikes straight at the ear, and the impression it leaves is so strong that many visitors afterwards cannot find words for a long time. Walk up to one of the basalt columns, take a small pebble in your hand or an ordinary metal key, and tap lightly on the polished surface. Just once, not hard, without effort, just as if you were pressing a doorbell. And then listen carefully to what happens next. The column answers, with a clear, resonant, shimmering tone. The sound lingers in the air for several long seconds, fading slowly, but not breaking off. High, bright, almost singing. No known stone in nature produces a sound like that. Only carefully cast bronze and copper bells produce a sound like that. Only tuned musical instruments produce a sound like that. A sound like that should not be coming out of a 5-ton basalt support that has stood under Indian monsoons for 800 years. This belongs to one of the strangest and least studied acoustic anomalies in world architecture. Because ringing columns are not exactly common in the world. There are the famous musical pillars in the Recherla Temple at Hampi, also in India, but those work on a completely different principle, hollow constructions deliberately tuned to specific notes. At Ramappa, there are no hollows. These are solid, monolithic basalt columns, and they sing anyway. And not just one column sings. Many of them do. Different ones, at different tones. Some give a lower, deeper hum. Others answer with a high, almost crystalline ring. There are columns which, when tapped, produce a complex chord of several overtones at once. The impression is that the whole temple is one enormous stone musical instrument tuned by an unknown master on a scale unknown to us. Specialists, naturally, could not ignore this. Indian geologists and acoustic engineers have repeatedly taken samples of the stone, brought along measuring equipment, chipped off fragments, analyzed the structure. The verdict is always the same. The material of the columns is perfectly ordinary basalt. The formula, standard. The composition, iron, magnesium, silicon, all the expected oxides in all the expected proportions. No admixtures, no metal veins inside, no air pockets, just stone. The same as in hundreds of other sites around the planet. And that is the strangest part of all, because in nature basalt does not ring, it does not sing, it does not resonate in this way. Take a basalt boulder from any volcanic range, strike it. You will get a dull, short, abrupt sound, quickly swallowed by the dense structure of the rock. Take an unworked basalt block at a quarry, the same. A dull thud. Silence. No music at all. At Ramappa, there is music. Long, clear, lingering in the air. Which means the matter is not the material itself. The matter is what the ancient masters did with this material. Some kind of treatment they applied. Some kind of inner structuring of the column which is invisible from the outside and does not show up in a simple chemical analysis. Modern science offers only one even vaguely plausible version: the technology of stone casting. The idea is that basalt, in a molten state, is poured into a mold, and on cooling it, retains a solid, monolithic structure with specific acoustic properties. Roughly speaking, it is concrete, but made of natural stone, without cement and without binders. Such a technology really does exist, and modern industry uses it for lining aggressive environments, for protective coatings in nuclear plants, for underground pipelines. The material is called cast stone, or metallurgy. But here is the catch. To do this casting, a temperature of 1500 degrees Celsius is required. Stable, controllable, sustained for hours. In an Indian village of the 13th century, in conditions where even an ordinary blacksmith's forge was a technological peak of the age. Where and how this was done, nobody can explain. And if not stone casting, then there remains an even more fantastic hypothesis: some technique of resonant tuning of the stone. That is, during the carving, the master deliberately shaped the inner crystal lattice geometry of the column so that the whole monolith would function as a resonator. Beautiful in theory, impossible to verify, even harder to reproduce. Yet for the builders of Ramappa themselves, this ringing was clearly not an accidental side effect. It was the intention. In the ancient Indian tradition, temples have always been treated as living entities with their own voices. And the voice of Ramappa is not a metaphor. It is a physical reality that can be heard with your own ears, recorded on a dictaphone, measured with instruments, and which modern physicists, geologists, and engineers have no idea what to do with. There is a curious observation made by local villagers. According to them, if you tap on the columns in a certain sequence, you can set off harmonic layerings of sound in the air, so that the entire space fills with a multi-layered hum resembling choral singing. It is quite possible that the temple was designed for exactly this, so that during rituals the priests could produce an acoustic effect powerful enough to stop the breath of the worshippers. sound as part of architecture, stone as a musical instrument, a building as a living being capable of speech. And all of this in the 13th century, in a remote Indian province, with the help of tools that, according to every official textbook, local craftsmen simply did not possess. And now, when too many riddles have accumulated and each new one hits harder than the last, modern science makes an attempt to save face. It has to explain this somehow. You cannot just throw up your hands and say, "We do not know." That would be indecent for the 21st century, with its satellites, its supercomputers, and its theory of relativity. And so a single, more or less plausible version gets pulled out into the light. It is called stone casting. The idea is simple and even elegant. If you cannot cut the required shapes out of a solid block, then that block was created already in the required shape from the start. That is, the basalt was not chiseled, it was poured, in molten, liquid flowing form, like cast iron in a metallurgical plant, like concrete on a modern construction site. Only it was not a cement mix, but a genuine, hot, red glowing stone mass, poured into a mold, left to cool, and out came a finished part. A column, a sculpture, a bracket, with any curves, any carving, any internal channels built into the mold in advance. This belongs to a very real and long-known industrial technology. It exists. It is in use. In the specialist literature, it is called metallurgy, from the Greek roots for stone and work. In modern industry, metallurgical products are used to line metallurgical furnaces, to coat tunnels, to make protective layers for aggressive chemical environments. Where ordinary metal corrodes and concrete crumbles, solidified molten basalt stands for decades. Its strength is twice that of the highest quality granite. Its acid resistance is at the maximum. Its wear resistance is unique. In other words, modern science does not in principle deny that basalt can be melted, poured into a mold, and turned into a monolithic product. What is more, this approach neatly explains nearly every mystery of Ramappa all at once. The mirror polish of 5-ton statues? Easy, cast in a carefully prepared mold, polished on the surface afterwards. The curved through channels inside the stone? Simple. Before pouring, a wax or clay rod of the required curvature is placed inside the mold and later burned or washed out. The acoustic ring of the columns? Explainable. Under directional, controlled cooling of the melt, the crystal lattice builds up in a particular way and gives resonant properties which natural basalt does not and cannot have. One hypothesis, and every inconsistency is swept away in a single move. Beautiful? Very beautiful. Convincing? It would seem so. Except there is one small but fundamental question left. How exactly was this actually done? Because basalt is a material with a temper. It does not melt in a stove, not in a campfire, not in an ordinary blacksmith's forge. Its transition temperature into the liquid state is 1500 degrees Celsius. That is not merely very hot. That is a temperature at which cast iron has long since turned to flow. Copper has evaporated and iron has reached a fluid state. That is the level of an industrial-grade blast furnace. Even a modern steelworks runs on exactly those parameters and requires the most complex equipment to do so. Now think about it. 1500 degrees. In the 13th century, in the Indian village of Palampet, without electricity, without natural gas, without liquid fuel, without forced ventilation driven by motorized blowers, without industrial-quality refractory brick. How? On what fuel? In what furnaces? With what draft? Ordinary wood in a campfire reaches between 600 and 900 degrees. Charcoal with good bellows can reach up to 1300. Coal can reach 1500, but in 13th century India it was practically not in use, and certainly not in a provincial village like Palampet. So the version with ordinary fuel falls away. which leaves only one option: specially processed coke or coal dust fed into the furnace under constant forced oxygen blast. In essence, a miniature blast furnace process. This belongs to a technology that Europe only mastered in the 18th and 19th centuries with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. Before that, nothing of the kind existed anywhere on the planet, at least not officially. And here a chain of logical consequences begins to unfold, which makes official historians distinctly uncomfortable. If Ramappa was really built using stone casting, then medieval India must have had a developed metallurgy of blast furnace level. That means furnaces. That means workshops. That means coal mines, or at least stockpiles of high-quality fuel. That means engineers capable of calculating temperature regimes and holding them stable for hours. That means mold makers able to produce heat-resistant casting forms for 5-ton monoliths. That means entire dynasties of masters passing this knowledge from generation to generation. Archaeologists would still be finding the traces of such an industry today. Because a blast furnace is not a needle you can hide in the ground. It is a massive structure that leaves behind slag dumps for centuries, burnt refractory brick, metallic contamination in the soil, raised concentrations of iron and sulfur, characteristic chemical markers. Such traces are clearly visible, for instance, at the sites of medieval metallurgical centers in Europe, in China, in the Middle East. In 13th century India, and specifically around Ramappa, not a single such trace has been found. No slag fields, no furnace remains, no characteristic changes in the soil, nothing. What we are left with is a strange picture. Either stone casting really was in use, in which case we are dealing with a whole invisible industry that seemingly evaporated the moment the work was done, leaving not the slightest trace of its own existence. Or stone casting was not in use, in which case it is unclear exactly how those features of the temple, which only this technology can explain, were ever produced. Both versions are bad. Both put official history in an awkward position, and neither gives a final answer. The question remains open, and with each passing year, it is heard louder and louder. Let us now step one level deeper into this uncomfortable topic, because any discussion of stone casting does not stop at a single temple called Ramappa. It runs up against India itself, its history, its resources, its industrial base. And this is where contradictions start to surface that make academics want to flip the page as quickly as possible. Let us begin with the simple part. 1500 degrees Celsius is not some abstract figure from a physics textbook. It is a very specific technological threshold below which basalt will never, under any conditions, begin to melt. Full stop. That is exactly why volcanic lava pouring out of the Earth's depths at 1100, at most 1200 degrees, cools down into basalt flows rather than remaining liquid. Extra heat is required, and it has to be stable, long-lasting, controllable. Without that, there is no casting, only hand carving, with a hammer and a chisel, over months and years. This belongs to the fundamental laws of physics, which are not overridden by cultural features of the region, by the skill of craftsmen, or by the generosity of patrons. Basalt is the same everywhere, in India, in Iceland, in Japan, in Africa, and everywhere it melts at the same temperature. Which means that if Ramappa shows signs of stone casting, its builders had access to a source of such heat, and such heat is produced only by very specific types of fuel in very specific types of furnaces. Let us unpack the fuel question in more detail. Ordinary wood in a campfire burns at around 600 to 900 degrees. 1500 is an unreachable ceiling. Charcoal, with proper bellows, reaches up to 1200, in exceptional cases 1300. Not enough. Raw coal can reach 1500 in theory, but in real combustion conditions, with all losses accounted for, you might get 1300 on a good day. In other words, Even good coal on its own will not melt basalt. What is needed is coke, that is, pre-processed coal, roasted without access to air, with all volatile impurities driven out, which burns with a smokeless concentrated heat of 1500 degrees and more. Coke is not a natural resource. It is a processed product. Producing it requires a separate technology, specialized coke ovens, knowledge of how to regulate the roasting process, how many hours to hold it, how fast to cool it down. The mass production of coke is documented in world history, starting roughly in the middle of the 18th century, when Abraham Darby in England put the process on an industrial footing. Before that, there were isolated cases in Song-era China and a few experiments in the German lands. Systematic industrial production only began in the 18th century. Now pay attention. Not a single Indian chronicle, not a single archaeological report, not one of the more than 1,000 surviving Kakatiya-era inscriptions contains a mention of coke production. Not a single description of a blast furnace, not a single drawing of a smelting furnace of the required capacity. Complete silence, as if this technology never existed. As if every bearer of such knowledge simultaneously forgot how it was done and left no line for posterity. And then there is the second factor. Coke is only half the job. For it to burn at the required intensity, you need a constant inflow of oxygen under pressure. In other words, a forced blast system. In modern blast furnaces, powerful electric compressors push preheated air into the furnace at several atmospheres of pressure. Without electricity, such a blast can be produced only by a water wheel driving the bellows, or by a whole brigade of workers pumping air manually around the clock. Both of these systems leave traces, either in the form of surviving hydraulic engineering works or in the form of descriptions in economic records. Neither has been found anywhere in the vicinity of Ramappa. Then there is the refractory lining. Even if you have the coke and the blast, you still need a furnace that can endure 1500 degrees for hours on end without falling apart. Modern refractory brick is made from special clay with added aluminium oxide and silica, fired under extreme conditions. Medieval ceramics cannot hold such temperatures. They melt and flow like glass. Which means the ancient Indians must have had some special material for lining their smelting furnaces. Traces of this material, once again, are nowhere to be found. Not in excavations, not in written descriptions, not in samples held in Indian museums. Now let us put it all together. If Ramappa was truly built using the technology of stone casting, then somewhere in the India of that time, there must have existed coke ovens, coal mines, forced blast systems, workshops producing refractory brick, foundries with multi-ton furnaces, mold-making workshops, raw material warehouses, and transport routes capable of moving 5-ton castings. In effect, an entire industrial zone comparable to the early 19th century, with thousands of workers, with engineers, with logistics, with infrastructure. Traces of that industry, zero, an absolute zero. Nothing has survived. Not a single workshop, not a single mine, not a single slag dump, not a single inscription in which a master would have boasted of his ability to melt stone. Not a single engraving depicting such a process. Not a single folk legend, and Indian legends describe in detail things far less significant, from the local beer brewing customs to the private lives of street dancers. And this is no longer a mystery of one temple, it is a mystery of an entire civilization. Either the ancient Indians possessed technology surpassing the European Industrial Revolution by half a millennium, and classified their production so tightly that not a speck of dust from it remains. Or they mastered some fundamentally different way of working with stone, of which we today have absolutely no understanding whatsoever. Frankly, there is no third option. At this point, official science does what it usually does when it runs into a wall. It turns away and changes the subject. It says, Well, we do not yet know all the details. It promises, we will figure it out eventually. It urges, let us not jump to conclusions. Meanwhile, Ramappa stands and keeps ringing through its basalt columns, silently reminding us that somewhere between the 13th century and our own time, humanity lost an important piece of knowledge and most likely will never get it back. Admittedly, we have drifted rather far from the temple itself, off toward blast furnaces, coal coking, the Industrial Revolution, and the industrial landscapes which simply did not exist in medieval India and could not have existed there. All of this is important. Without it, the picture does not come together. But at some point, the argument risks turning into a lecture on metallurgy, and we are talking about stone, about carving, about a living monument still standing, one you can walk up to and touch with your own hand. And here we have to be honest about one thing. The riddle of basalt casting, which we just discussed, is not the riddle of a single temple called Ramappa. It is the riddle of India as a whole. Because the same mirror-polished basalt appears in other places across the subcontinent. 5-ton monolithic statues are not only here. Carvings with impossible internal channels are not only here. The entire south of India, every medieval temple complex from Karnataka to Tamil Nadu, is literally strewn with objects which modern science can neither explain nor reproduce. This belongs to an entire stratum of Indian stone culture, which Western researchers have been discovering with astonishment for more than 1 century now. And every discovery adds new questions. Kailasa at Ellora, a temple carved top-down out of a single cliff with 2 million cubic feet of rock removed by hand. The temples of Thanjavur, with their multi-ton crowning stones lifted to the height of a 30-story building. Mamallapuram, with its stone chariots hewn from single monoliths, as if they had not been chiseled but molded, the way clay is molded. This whole mass is not simply a collection of monuments, it is the trace of some coherent, systematic, deeply worked-out tradition of working with stone, of which the legacy remains while the knowledge itself has scattered, vanished, evaporated. Separate books could be written about this, separate films could be made. And books and films are being written and made. But today we are dealing with Ramappa, which means it is time to return to it, to that very quiet, star-shaped structure beside the tiny village of Palampet, to its red sandstone and black basalt, to its mirror-polished spirits on the columns, to its curved channels and its singing stone. Because the temple still has several trump cards up its sleeve, and we have not even turned them over yet. Because everything we have talked about up to this moment concerns only how Ramappa was built. What lies ahead is the story of how it survived, how it made it through what almost no other building in the region made it through, how it lived to our day, not merely in one piece, but in almost its original condition. And behind all that stands yet another technology which modern science is also unable to reproduce. Let us return to Ramappa, this time with particular attention to what happened to it in the year 1843. And so, the 8th of May, 1843, southern India. A clear morning turns into a hot day, the way any other May day turns in these latitudes. Nothing hints at trouble. Peasants work in the fields, ordinary life goes on in the villages. At the market in Palampet, traders are laying out fresh vegetables. The Ramappa Temple has been standing on its star-shaped foundation for more than 6 centuries by now, and it stands exactly as it stood yesterday, as it stood under the Mughals, as it stood when the first envoys of the British East India Company arrived. Silent, solid, dependable. And then, at some moment, the ground underfoot begins to tremble. At first just barely, as if a heavy cart had rolled by. Then stronger. Then sharply, massively, with the full force of a tectonic strike rising from somewhere deep below. An earthquake begins, one of the most destructive in the history of this region. In scale and aftermath, it will be discussed for years afterwards in the reports of the British administration and in local chronicles. This belongs to that category of natural disasters after which practically nothing remains of medieval and especially of early modern buildings. Masonry laid with lime mortar falls apart under sharp lateral loads like a house of cards. Wooden ceilings collapse inward onto the walls. Tall towers go down first, unable to withstand the inertia of their upper tiers. Arches burst at the keystones. Columns pop out of their sockets like corks from bottles. The result is always the same: piles of rubble where houses, palaces and sanctuaries stood only the day before. And this is exactly what happens across the whole district. The village of Palampe is almost completely destroyed. Not a single one of its mud brick huts is left intact. The stone houses of the wealthier residents lose their walls. The temples of nearby settlements, many of them the same age as Ramappa, or even younger, are reduced to heaps of stone. Wells crack open, roads split with sudden gaps. In places, the ground itself changes elevation by several dozen centimeters, sinking here, bulging up there. A picture characteristic of a powerful earthquake, clearly above a magnitude of 6 or 7 on the modern scale. The sources from that time state that in the surrounding area, no intact buildings remained at all, and only in the center of this stone massacre, above the sea of debris and dust, one silhouette continues to stand: the Ramappa Temple. Dented, damaged, cut at the knees by the underground force, but standing. Let us come closer and see what happened to it. The picture is a curious one. The stone blocks of the floor, massive, carefully fitted, each one weighing hundreds of kilograms, rose up, lifted, heaved in a wave, the way ice lifts on a river during the spring breakup. Some blocks drifted apart, leaving gaps between them. Others tipped upward at an angle. The floor of the temple literally played under the shocks, but did not shatter, did not split, did not develop cracks. It followed the motion of the earth, flexibly, pliably, almost elastically. The columns, those same 5-ton, mirror-polished, singing columns, sank by almost half a meter. Each one descended into its own base by a distance that, for any ordinary stone building, would have meant the instant collapse of the entire structure. In any other temple, such a settling of the supports would have caused the roof to tear off the columns, plunge downward, and drag the whole construction with it. Ramappa did not collapse. The columns sank evenly, synchronously, all together, as if someone had calculated in advance that under strong oscillations they should indeed settle rather than scatter. The roof went down with them, but remained whole, still resting squarely on its supports. Cracks in the walls, breaks in the masonry, dislodged stones, very few. Somewhere a piece of decorative carving chipped off, somewhere a corner block shifted, but the overall structure of the temple survived a disaster that reduced everything around it to rubble. The British officials who compiled the post-earthquake damage reports noted, as a separate line item, that in the Palampe area only one major building remained standing: the ancient Hindu temple by the lake. Everything else, ruins. Local people took this in one unambiguous way. The temple is sacred. The temple is protected by higher powers. The temple knows how to stand because it was not built by ordinary men. This belief is alive in the village even today, nearly 2 centuries after the event. The descendants of those who witnessed the earthquake with their own eyes still retell that night when everything around was falling, and Ramappa did not fall. Official science disagrees with mysticism, but cannot refute the facts. 800 years of standing. One of the most destructive earthquakes of the region, passing almost directly overhead. The neighboring village in ruins. The surrounding shrines in pieces, and the temple in place, with a buckled floor. with settled columns, with its mirror-polished carvings, its singing stones, and its floating bricks in the tower, which we will discuss shortly. Standing, not fallen. And here rises the very question for the sake of which this whole story was worth telling. How? How did a 13th century building, made of stone, with no steel frame, no reinforced concrete foundation, no modern seismic isolators, withstand an impact of such force? What was built into its design that was not present in the design of its neighboring temples? What calculation, what trick, what knowledge? There is an answer. What is more, that answer astonishes no less than the mysteries of the construction itself. We will move on to it next. And the answer rings in a way that belongs in strength of materials textbooks, in capital letters and with an exclamation mark. Because the builders of Ramappa in the 13th century applied an engineering solution which the Western world would discover for itself only in the 20th. Today it is called sandbox technology. Back then, apparently, it did not even have a special name. It simply existed. It was simply known. Let us begin at the very bottom. Before laying the first stone, the builders dug a pit beneath the future temple. Not a half-meter foundation trench, the way most medieval buildings were done. A full-scale pit, 3 meters deep, across the entire footprint of the foundation. An enormous volume of earthworks, requiring hundreds of workers and weeks of labor. That detail alone tells you that the approach was extremely serious, unlike anything typical for a provincial construction site. Further on, it gets even more interesting. They did not fill the pit with stone. They did not pour lime mortar. They did not pack clay into it. They filled it with a special mixture whose composition was decoded only in the 1980s through joint research by the Indian Archaeological Department and the National Institute of Technology in Warangal. That is when this technology first entered scientific circulation. Its official name, sandbox technology, was formalized in 1991 at a specialized archaeologists' conference. The mixture has 4 components. The base, river sand of a specific fraction. The additive, granite powder, providing density and load-bearing capacity. The binder, jaggery sugar powder, which, when moistened, turns into a viscous, elastic mass. And finally, the exotic component, crushed fruit of the Terminalia cebula plant, better known in Indian tradition as haritaki or black myrobalan. This plant has a high tannin content, and when combined with moisture and sugar, forms a stable colloidal structure that does not rot, does not decay, and in fact only compacts further over time. This belongs to the field which modern engineering calls base seismic isolation. The idea is simple and brilliant at the same time. If the ground under a building cannot be held still during tremors, then the vibrations themselves must be prevented from reaching the building. You need a buffer. You need a cushion. You need an intermediate medium that will absorb and dissipate the shockwave, transforming it from a destructive blow into a soft rocking motion. This is exactly what the sand mixture of Ramappa does. It works as a giant damper. It takes on all the primary and secondary seismic waves, dampens them within its plastic mass, and only the remainders, weakened, distributed, harmless, reach the stone masonry of the temple above. Modern seismic isolators beneath the skyscrapers of Japan and California work on the very same principle. Only there, instead of sand with jaggery, they use multi-layer rubber pads with metal plates, lead cores, friction pendulums, pneumatic dampers. Expensive equipment, calculated on computers and manufactured in industrial plants. The effect, identical. The mass of the building floats above the trembling ground. The gap in time, 1,300 years. But this is only the first layer of protection. Above the sand cushion, a slab system was laid for the floor. And here comes the second engineering trick. The stone blocks of the floor are not laid in a continuous bond. They are not rigidly tied to the columns. They are not sealed with mortar. Between them run precisely calculated joints, connected by special interlocking slots. In other words, the floor of the temple is a set of large, heavy, mutually engaged slabs, which, under strong shocks, can shift slightly relative to one another. They can slide, they can rise, they can return to their places. But they cannot scatter, they cannot split, they cannot break out of the overall structure. This is exactly why, during the earthquake of 1843, the floor slabs heaved up, as we said before. They played out exactly as the ancient masters had planned. They absorbed the blow through deformation, yet preserved their overall integrity. In modern engineering, this is called a dissipative system. The term appeared in the 20th century. The technology, at least as far back as the 13th. The third layer of protection is the most fantastic of all. In the walls, in the columns, and even in the ceiling beams of the temple, special channels were drilled, and into these channels molten iron was poured. Not iron rods inserted afterwards, not forged brackets hammered in, but actual molten metal, which on cooling formed a monolithic iron dowel, binding the neighboring stone blocks together permanently. These iron dowels function as reinforcement. They prevent the masonry from pulling apart under lateral loads. They hold the columns in their sockets. They turn separate stone elements into a single, elastically connected frame. And here, pay attention, molten iron, which means the builders of Ramappa had a stable source of 1500 degrees of temperature, precisely the one which, according to the official version, Indians in the 13th century could not possibly have possessed. With this temperature, they not only possibly cast basalt columns, they also poured iron cores deep inside the stone, carefully and precisely into pre-drilled channels, on a massive scale, throughout the whole temple, with seismic loads in mind. To sum up, sand cushion, floating floor with interlocking joints, iron dowels in molten form, 3 layers of protection working together in synchrony. The first dampens the vibration before it even reaches the building. The second allows the structure to flex without breaking. The third holds the stone elements together in case the first 2 cannot handle the strain. And all of this was thought through, calculated, and executed 800 years ago in an Indian province by people who, according to our textbooks, were just barely exiting the Bronze Age. Official science acknowledges the facts. UNESCO, in its 2021 decision, stated directly, the use of sandbox foundation, floating bricks, and thoughtful selection of materials allowed for the reduction of load on the temple structure and ensured its seismic resistance. The only question is this: where did the builders of Ramappa get such knowledge in the first place? Who taught them? Whose blueprints were they working from? Where did they do their internship? The answers, as always, remain silent. Now, to the most spectacular, most enigmatic, and most stubborn riddle of Ramappa of all. The one that has had modern materials scientists holding their heads for decades, and which they still cannot properly explain. The riddle of the bricks. The very bricks that make up the tower of the temple, rising above the main structure. Except these are no ordinary bricks. Take one in your hand, and the first thing that will strike you is the weight, or rather, the near absence of it. This brick is as light as a piece of hardened foam, 3 to 4 times lighter than a regular brick made from the same clay. Drop it into water, and something will happen that should not happen to any normal building material. It will not sink. It will stay on the surface. It will float, bobbing on the ripples like a wooden chip. 800 years old, kiln-fired, weathered by monsoons and earthquakes, and still stubbornly refusing to go under. This belongs to a class of materials which science calls floating bricks. In world history, there are exactly 2 recorded examples. The first, in the Tower of Ramappa. The second in the mausoleum of Emperor Humayun in Delhi, built more than 3 centuries later. And in both cases, researchers have reached the same conclusion. The production technology is identical, or at least extremely similar. But the original source of that technology, the master recipe, the authors and craftsmen themselves, remain unknown to everyone. How is such a thing even possible? Physics gives an unambiguous answer. The density of water is 1 gram per cubic centimeter. For a material to float, its density must be less than 1. The density of modern building brick is from 2.2 grams per cubic centimeter and up. That is more than twice denser than water. Such a brick sinks like a stone. The density of the Ramappa bricks, a mere 9/10 of a gram per cubic centimeter. This has been measured, documented, and rechecked by researchers of the Geotechnology Appraisal and Evaluation of Kakatiya Monuments Project, headed in the 1980s by Indian Civil Service officer B.V. Papa Rao. 9/10 of a gram per cubic centimeter. The density of light wood, the density of cork, and yet a full-fledged kiln-fired brick, durable, long-lasting, capable of carrying the weight of the stone superstructure above it, holding its shape for 8 centuries. Not a single modern structural ceramic delivers such parameters. The comparison with pumice suggests itself, but it does not hold. Pumice is frozen volcanic foam. Its porosity is natural, its structure is brittle, and it cannot be used as a load-bearing material in tower walls. Pumice crumbles, pumice cracks under load. Pumice cannot be fired in a kiln. The floating bricks of Ramappa are bricks in the full sense. Ceramic firing, regular geometric shape, straight edges, the ability to carry masonry and bear serious weight. And with all that, lighter than water. What is inside them? That question, it would seem, has been resolved. The Indian chemist Dr. Habib Haman, chief chemist of the Government Industrial Laboratory in Hyderabad, back in the 20th century, ran a series of analyses on samples from Ramappa. His verdict was clear. The material giving the bricks their porous structure is sawdust. Ordinary wood sawdust. Mixed into the clay before firing, at high temperature it burns out, leaving behind an even network of microscopic voids inside the body of the brick. Air takes the place of wood. The density drops. The mass decreases. The brick becomes light and capable of floating. It sounds simple. On paper, even elegant. The formula is known. The ingredients are available. The logic of the process is obvious to any modern ceramicist. And yet, nobody today can reproduce this result. Not in Indian workshops working with traditional clay. Not in European experimental laboratories. Not in modern construction ceramic factories with programmable kilns and precise temperature control. Why does it not work? Because in practice, everything turns out far more complicated than in theory. First, a precise ratio of sawdust to clay is required. A bit too much sawdust, and the brick crumbles into dust at the first touch after firing. A bit too little, and there is not enough porosity. The brick will not float. Second, the type of sawdust matters. From which specific tree species, of what age, how finely ground. Third, the quality of the clay is critical. Its chemical composition, its fat content, its shrinkage on drying. Fourth, an extremely accurate firing temperature regime is required. Too cold, and the sawdust does not burn out, remaining inside as carbon inclusions which over time produce cracks. Too hot, and the structure of the brick body melts and its porosity collapses. And now the main point. At Ramappa, everything is done perfectly. All proportions are observed. All the bricks are identical. All of them float. All of them hold. All of them have been standing for 800 years. In other words, the master who produced this ceramic possessed the technology at a level no one in the world has mastered today. Modern experimenters, reproducing this recipe, end up with either brittle, crumbling half-products or ordinary dense bricks without any floating properties. Hitting precisely the very formula known to the Indian ceramicist of the 13th century has not been achieved over 4 decades of research. And a logical engineering question arises. Why all this complexity in the first place? Why spend resources, time, and craftsmanship on producing a unique material if ordinary heavy bricks would have served the function just as well? The answer is simple and elegant. The Tower of Ramappa stands on those very basalt columns, on 5-ton supports with mirror carving. And if you load those columns with a heavy stone or regular brick superstructure, the whole building could slide downward under its own weight at any moment. But if the tower is made from ultralight bricks, its mass is reduced by 3 or 4 times. The load on the columns becomes manageable. The center of gravity of the building drops. Seismic stability increases. Everything comes together, which means the floating bricks are no whim. No attempt to impress the viewer. It is a deliberate engineering solution integrated into the overall concept of the building as a seismically resistant, long-lasting, harmoniously balanced structure. But this ceramic was invented by someone who thought in categories that, in the 13th century, apparently did not exist at all. Someone who understood material density as a physical quantity, who calculated loads on supports, who thought through mass distribution across levels. A modern civil engineer learns these concepts in the 3rd or 4th year of university. The master of Ramappa, by all indications, commanded them freely and effortlessly in a remote Indian province without a single notebook, without a single formula, without a single reference table. And here only one honest conclusion remains. We know what he did. We know what he made it from. We see the result, standing, shining, ringing, floating, functioning for 800 years. And we cannot reproduce a single one of the 4 main wonders of Ramappa. Not the stone casting, not the curved through channels, not the singing basalt, not the floating bricks. The technologies have been lost. The knowledge has dispersed in time. Only the building remains, a silent witness, material proof that once our distant predecessors knew how to do far more than we can do today. And now, the most uncomfortable question of all. The very one we placed in the title at the very beginning, and which has hovered over every new mystery of the temple like an invisible cloud. Who really built Ramappa? Because one version we have already examined. Talented Indian masters of the 13th century who possessed technologies at the level of the Industrial Revolution, yet somehow managed to leave behind not a single production trace after their work, not a single entry in teaching scrolls, not a single disciple capable of repeating anything their masters had done. A pretty version, one that saves the reputation of official history, but one that cracks at the seams under any serious examination. That leaves another version. Not as convenient, not as safe, not as politically correct, but far more honest when measured against the facts. Perhaps Ramappa is not the first temple built using these technologies, but the last. Perhaps we are dealing with the final echo of some far more ancient, far more advanced culture, whose fragments of knowledge survived into the 13th century in the form of sacred traditions, passed from mouth to mouth, from master to disciple, from generation to generation. And at some point in Palampe, there happened to converge one master, one patron, one guild, capable of gathering the scattered shards into a single whole and building what we see today. This belongs to a hypothesis that serious scholars prefer to avoid, and which researchers of unconventional versions, by contrast, develop with enthusiasm. The hypothesis states, long before the emergence of the first recognized civilizations on Earth, some highly developed culture already existed. Possibly human, possibly not quite. From that culture came stone monuments scattered across the world. The pyramids of Egypt, the megaliths of Baalbek, the stonework of Machu Picchu, the polished sculptures of Mohenjo-Daro, the temples of southern India, and among them, Ramappa. Different materials, different latitudes, different eras by official chronology. Yet the same signature everywhere, a technological perfection which is never repeated anywhere else. And who was that culture? Here, at this point, we run into the final dead end of knowledge. What remains are only guesses. Some say it was an Atlantean or Lemurian civilization, destroyed in some global catastrophe 10 or 15,000 years before our era. Some say it was a previous cycle of human evolution, about which our textbooks tell us nothing at all. And some, and this is the sharpest, most provocative version of them all, claim it was not human beings in the first place. That in deep antiquity, representatives of another extraterrestrial civilization visited Earth. They taught, they passed on knowledge, they left, and we spent a long time afterwards calling them gods. Indian mythology, it must be said, feeds this version generously. The Vedas, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, all these ancient texts are full of descriptions of flying craft called vimanas, weapons that destroy entire cities with flashes of bright light, beings with superhuman capabilities. Modern popularizers of science brush such descriptions aside as poetic metaphor, but read literally, they speak of technologies that suspiciously resemble aircraft, missiles, nuclear weapons, and other achievements of our own era, only described several thousand years before humanity officially invented any of them. And if anywhere on Indian soil, there ought to remain temples built not from the blueprints of human architects, but from the covenants of God teachers, Ramappa is one of the strongest candidates for that role. Everything in it speaks to this. Technology exceeding its era, knowledge that could not possibly have belonged to provincial craftsmen, engineering solutions that reappear 700 years later in modern design, acoustics, material science, seismic isolation, metallurgy, all in one building, and all of it working, and all of it standing, and all of it silent. Perhaps in the 13th century, something remarkable took place in Palampet. To an ordinary feudal kingdom, one of dozens in that era, there came a master, the keeper of an ancient tradition, perhaps the last one of his line, perhaps the only one who still remembered the full recipe. He offered General Recherla Rudra the chance to build not merely a temple, but a temple according to those very old covenants. The general, a hard and pragmatic man, agreed. He allocated the resources, he gathered the finest stonemasons, ceramicists, metal casters. 40 years the work went on. 40 years the master passed on to his disciples whatever he still remembered. And then he passed away. And with him, the last living link in that chain of knowledge flickered out. Why did no one ever build anything like Ramappa after it? Why are the neighboring temples of the same era so ordinary, so understandable, so ruined today? Because the disciples did not manage to absorb everything in time. Because part of the secrets went into the grave with the master. Because to repeat such a miracle, the skill of the hand alone is not enough. What is needed is that ancient understanding which is transmitted only through an unbroken tradition, and which snaps the moment the chain breaks. In that sense, Ramappa is not the beginning, it is the end. The final flash of knowledge which managed to take material form in stone before fading forever. A stone testament, left to us by our forerunners, or by our gods, or by those whom one day we will learn to call by their proper name. It is a shame this knowledge is lost, a true shame. Today, with all our computing power, with all our space programs, with all our universities and academies, we cannot produce mirror-polished basalt. We cannot drill a curved channel inside solid stone. We cannot tune a stone column to a musical tone. We cannot fire a brick that refuses to sink in water. All of this was done by a man who lived 800 years ago in a remote Indian village, and none of it can be done by us. The Ramappa Temple is still standing today. It is open to visitors. Historians, engineers, art specialists, and casual travelers make their way to it. Some come for the aesthetics. Some come for a spiritual experience. Some come in the hope of feeling that very touch of ancient mystery which cannot be explained in words. Each one leaves with his own impression. But almost no one leaves with answers. Because there simply are no answers. There is only the temple, and the question in its name, and the silence in which its columns ring. And beyond that, everyone decides for himself. And with that, we wrap up our story for today. But the riddle of Ramappa Temple is far from the only mystery the past still hides from us. Our archive holds dozens of similar puzzles, stone structures which, by the logic of official history, simply should not exist. Technologies lost long before our great-grandfathers were even born. Names erased from textbooks, facts left out of every school and university curriculum. And if this story got under your skin, if you enjoy untangling uncomfortable facts together with us, do not forget to hit the like button under this video. It is the simplest way to support the channel and tell us, yes guys, keep going in exactly this direction. Every thumb up you leave is a signal to the algorithm to show our video to new viewers, just as curious and engaged as you are. If this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Every week we release new investigations, new stories, new breakdowns of topics that official science prefers to keep quiet about. Subscribing is free, it takes 1 second, and thanks to it, you will not miss the next episode. And a separate request, please click the bell icon right next to the subscribe button. Turn notifications on. Because as practice shows, YouTube does not always show new videos, even to people who are already subscribed. With the bell active, you will find out about every new video the moment it comes out. And down in the comments under this video, write what you yourself think about Ramappa Temple. Do you believe the version with forgotten forerunners and ancient teachers? Or do you lean toward the idea that it was all the work of ordinary Indian craftsmen who simply happened to be enormously talented? What other mysterious structures of the past would you like to see covered in our upcoming episodes? We personally read every single comment, and many of them become the seeds of our next investigations. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourselves, and remember the main thing. History is far stranger than we are ever told.